You're scrolling your phone with coffee in one hand and doom scrolling with the other, and two headlines hit your feed within 30 seconds of each other. First one says JPMorgan Chase is approaching a $1 trillion market cap, which would make it the first bank in history to do it. Second one says ICBC, the world's biggest bank by assets, is worth less than Home Depot. You pause and scroll back up and squint because your brain refuses to file this under normal news. So you read that second headline again. ICBC, Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, holds $7.6 trillion in assets, which is more than the GDP of Japan and more than Germany and the UK combined. It's the largest bank on planet Earth by almost every measure that matters. Like deposits, loans, branches, employees, raw financial firepower, and if you're like most people, you've never heard of it. And the market says it's worth $326 billion, which is the punchline you're about to understand. JPMorgan is worth roughly $935 billion, knocking on the door of $1 trillion, which is 3 times the value. But here's the thing, JPMorgan has about $5 trillion in assets, roughly 2/3 of ICBC's balance sheet. So what does this tell you about why the market worships one and discount the other like a clearance rack sweater? You probably think you know the answer, that Western investors trust American institutions and Chinese banks are opaque because they're state-controlled and they lend to zombie companies because the state tells them to. The market is pricing in corruption, inefficiency, and political meddling because it doesn't trust what it can't see. That's the story you've been told, and sure, there's some truth in it, but here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because if you dig into how JPMorgan actually survives, and how any major American bank survives, you'll find something that sounds a lot like the thing we criticize China for. You've been told America runs on free markets and merit, and that China runs on state capitalism where the government picks favorites, backstops losses, and never lets the big guys die. But what if I told you that JPMorgan, the crown jewel of American finance, exists today because the US government has repeatedly stepped in to save it? That its entire business model depends on an implicit guarantee that Washington will never let it fail. And that the only reason you can deposit your paycheck there without fear is because you know, deep down, that Uncle Sam has the backstop ready? And what if I told you that ICBC's low valuation isn't just about Chinese opacity? It's about something deeper, something about how markets price certainty versus control, and that trumps America right now in 2026, is drifting toward the very state capitalism it lectures Beijing about. You're about to see the global financial system for what it actually is. Not a battle between free markets and state control, but a spectrum where both superpowers are sliding toward the middle. By the end of this video, you'll understand why your bank account is more political than you think, why the $1 trillion market cap isn't a sign of American superiority, and why the next financial crisis might not come from where you expect. Let's start with the uncomfortable question nobody asks. What does JPMorgan actually sell? Banking services, or the illusion that the state will catch you when you fall? Picture this. You walk into the biggest bank on earth. And you, me, everyone, all of our money flows through places like this, not on Wall Street and not in London. You might think that's a safe distance, but it's not, because money doesn't care about geography. You're in Beijing and you're staring at ICBC, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, which has $7.6 trillion in assets. Let that number sit in your brain for a second, because that's more than JPMorgan, more than Bank of America, more than everything you've ever touched, more than any bank in human history, and you've probably never thought about it once. And you're thinking, this must be the most valuable financial institution on the planet. But you'd be wrong, and I can prove it. But here's where your brain does a double take, because the numbers don't match the story you've been told. ICBC's market cap is $326 billion, which is less than you'd pay for a decent chunk of Silicon Valley, and that's it. You could buy every bank in your neighborhood and still have change. Wall Street looks at every dollar of ICBC's assets and says, yeah, I'll give you 4 cents for that, and I mean 4 cents. Meanwhile, JPMorgan gets 19 cents on the dollar, because the market believes JPMorgan's assets are real. So the market is telling you something, and here's the thing you need to hear. Those $7.6 trillion in assets aren't worth the paper they're printed on. And if you're wondering why, well, grab a seat, because this is where China's banking system stops being a spreadsheet and starts being a horror story. Okay, let's start with the number Chinese officials will tell you with a straight face, which is that non-performing loans are 1.31%. Sounds great, right? Your local credit union would kill for that ratio, because 1.31% sounds almost perfect. But here's the thing. You're not supposed to ask what's hiding behind that number, because independent analysts put the real NPL ratio at 10 to 20%. That's not a rounding error, because a bank with 10% bad loans isn't a bank, it's a sinking ship. That's the difference between healthy bank and we need a bailout yesterday, because once bad debt hits double digits, there's no going back. Absolute Strategy research estimates $3 trillion in hidden bad debt, and I mean $3 trillion. And here's the kicker. Chinese officials themselves in private admit the real number is 15 to 20%. So when you see that official 1.31%, you're not looking at data, you're looking at a magic trick. And you want proof? The National Audit Office caught banks hiding over 800 billion yuan in bad loans between 2020 and 24, and that's 800 billion. That's not a few bad mortgages in a drawer somewhere. That's systemic, and that's institutionalized deception. Now you might be thinking, okay, but every country has bad debt, so what makes China different? Here's what makes it different. In America, when a bank makes a bad loan, the bank eats the loss, shareholders get wiped out, and bankers lose their jobs. That's the deal, because in a real market, risk has a price. But in China, the banks aren't really banks, they're ATMs for the state. The governor of the People's Bank of China, that's their Fed chairman, admitted that 250 trillion yuan in loans are heavily weighted toward property developers and local government platforms, and that's 250 trillion. That's not lending based on will this business succeed, you know? The normal question, that's lending based on did the party tell us to lend? So you end up with zombie companies, and the Dallas Fed, not exactly a bastion of anti-China sentiment, found that zombie corporate assets jumped from 5% in 2018 to 16% in 2024. 16% of corporate assets are in companies that should be dead but aren't, because they're being kept alive by banks that keep lending them money to pay the interest on the old loans. And if that sounds familiar, you're right, because it's exactly what Japan did in the 1990s, and you know how that ended for Japan. 3 decades of stagnation, a lost generation, and China is doing it on a scale Japan never dreamed of. Then there's Evergrande, and you remember Evergrande, right? The property giant that collapsed under $300 billion in debt. But here's the part you might have missed. Roughly $400 billion of that exposure is sitting on China's banking system, and that's $400 billion. And that's just one developer, because there are dozens more just like it, all propped up by the same lend and pretend logic. So what does the state do when the banks start bleeding? It injects capital, and the big 6 state banks just got over $100 billion in capital injections through special government bonds. That's your money. Well, if you were a Chinese taxpayer, it would be your money, going straight into banks that hid bad loans, lent to zombies, and financed a property bubble that's now popping. And here's the thing. This isn't a bailout in the American sense, because in America, when the government bails out a bank, there's at least a pretense of accountability, like stress tests, restrictions on bonuses, and congressional hearings. In China, the banks are the state, the profits go to the state, the bad debts go to the state, and ultimately the bill goes to ordinary people. So here's what you need to understand about Chinese banking in one image. Picture a giant, a massive, towering giant with $7.6 trillion in assets and a market cap that suggests he's made of cardboard. And the only reason he's still standing is that his dad is the mayor. Because every time he's about to fall over, Dad shows up with a check and a warning. Don't tell anyone how bad it really is. That's ICBC, and that's the whole system. A giant propped up by my dad's the mayor. Now, here's the part where you should be asking yourself, if China's banks are this fragile, why hasn't the whole thing collapsed? And that's the question that leads you straight to JPMorgan. Because while Beijing was playing puppet master with its banks, Wall Street was building something else entirely. Something that doesn't need Dad to show up with a check. Something that, well, you'll see. Because in Chapter 2, you're going to meet the bank that America built, and you're going to learn why the market gives JPMorgan 19 cents on the dollar while ICBC gets 4. The answer isn't what you think. It's not about size, and it's not about power. It's about something much more uncomfortable, and once you see it, you'll never look at a bank balance sheet the same way again. All right, settle down, you with the lukewarm coffee and the 401 key. You're afraid to open, And you, the one who thinks too big to fail is just a slogan from a movie about the 2008 crisis. It's not a slogan. It's a business model. And it works because you believe the government won't let it fail, and right now it's wearing a very expensive suit, and I mean your suit. Today we're talking about JPMorgan. And before you yawn and click away to watch a video of a dog falling off a treadmill, understand this. Your financial life is a flea on this bank's tail. You just don't feel the wagging yet. Okay, folks, let's look at the numbers, because numbers don't lie even when bankers do. July 2026, JPMorgan's market cap is $935 billion, and let that sink in for a second. They're knocking on the door of $1 trillion, and you're helping them knock, whether you know it or not. Not revenue, not assets, market value. The first bank in human history to get that close to a number with 12 zeros, and they just posted the biggest quarterly profit in the history of American banking. The biggest ever. Now you might think, wow, those guys must be brilliant, all that hard work, all that risk management, all that alpha, and sure, Jamie Dimon probably has a very sharp pencil. But here's the but you should have seen coming. And this is a big, fluffy, orange but, because the reason JPMorgan can print money like a government with a broken printer isn't just because they're smart, it's because they can't die. You remember 2008? I was just a kitten, but I remember. The whole system was on fire. Lehman Brothers went poof. AIG, that insurance giant, was a day away from taking the entire global economy to the vet. Who got saved? AG, Citibank, Bank of America, and yes, JPMorgan didn't need a rescue the same way, but they took billions in guarantees and emergency loans. They were all in the same lifeboat, and the government was rowing. So here's the paradox, and trust me, you'll feel this one you need to scratch at. This is the most capitalist institution on earth. They worship at the altar of the free market. They'll tell you government regulation is a hairball in the throat of innovation. But their entire survival strategy, think about it. Their trillion-dollar valuation rests on the most socialist safety net ever woven, and it's called the implicit government guarantee. Too big to fail isn't a warning, it's a warranty. Think of it this way. JPMorgan is the hardest working student in the class. Top grades, perfect attendance. Always does the extra credit, impressive. But here's the twist. His life insurance policy is paid for by the entire class, every student, including the ones who are failing, chip in every week. So if the star student ever gets hit by a bus, the whole class covers the funeral, the hospital bills, and his lost future earnings. And meanwhile, the star student gets to take bigger risks. Because why not? He's not paying for the insurance, you are. But wait, that's the $1 trillion bet. The market isn't just betting on JPMorgan's earnings. It's betting that the U.S. government, meaning you, the taxpayer, will never let it fail. And the market is pricing in your obligation. Your deposits, your mortgage, your retirement fund, the little bit of interest you earn on your savings account that doesn't even buy a can of tuna, all of it is the premium. And it's a faith-based system, and you're the one kneeling at the altar. And you're deeper in this than you think. That mortgage you're paying, there's a good chance JPMorgan services it, and they make money off you either way. That 401 kilo you're scared to open is probably stuffed with JPMorgan funds. Your employer's payroll account, maybe? Your city's pension fund? Probably. They are the plumbing of your entire financial life, and the plumber has a guarantee that if he breaks a pipe, the city will pay for the water damage. But here's where it gets really interesting and where we're heading next. You see, this whole setup, the private profits, the public safety net, it's not pure capitalism. It's a hybrid, and right now, in 2026, with Trump sitting in the Oval Office, that hybrid is mutating. We're seeing a drift, not towards socialism, no, don't be dramatic, but towards something else, state capitalism, where the line between the government and the giants like JPMorgan gets so blurry, you can't tell if the bank is an arm of the state, or the state is an arm of the bank. Because if you think the government guaranteeing a bank is wild, wait until you see the government trying to run the economy like one. That's Chapter 3. And it's going to be a mess, so I'll bring the chalk, and you bring the antacids. We've all seen it. You remember when your cat watches a bird through the window, chittering with pure contempt, and then tries the exact same pounce on a housefly 2 minutes later? That's the energy we're channeling here. We look at Beijing's playbook, you hiss at it, and then you quietly borrow a few pages. The question isn't whether the claws are out, it's whose furniture is getting shredded. So let's talk about what actually happened. You had the government taking a 10% stake in Intel back in August 2025. Not a loan, not a tax break, equity. The CHIPS grant got converted into shares, which means Uncle Sam stopped being a benefactor and became a shareholder. You want to know what that feels like? It's like your landlord suddenly asking for a seat at your dinner table, not just the rent check. The state didn't just subsidize a chip maker. It bought a piece of the litter box. Then you had the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And in February 2025, the director gets fired, and the agency gets gutted. The House cut its budget by 70%. You don't need a degree in political science to see what that is. It's defanging the watchdog so the big dogs can roam. Think about it. The one agency designed to protect you from predatory lenders gets put on a starvation diet. That's not deregulation, that's declawing. And the Fed? Oh, you'll love this. April 2025, Trump posts, "Fire him ASAP and gut the Fed." The Dow drops 971 points in a single day. You know what that is? That's not just pressure. That's a president treating the central bank like a stubborn jar lid, banging it on the counter until it pops. But here's the thing. The Fed didn't pop, it bent, it winced, but it stayed independent. So you can't say the state captured the Fed. You can say it tried to put a leash on it and got a very public growl in return. Fast forward to August 2026, coordinated yen intervention, first in about 30 years. You read that right. The Treasury steps into currency markets with Japan, not to stabilize the dollar, but to manage the yen. That's not normal. That's your neighbor borrowing your hose to water his lawn and then telling you how to hold it. You're intervening in another country's currency because your own trade policy made the exchange rate a political weapon. That's state capitalism with a diplomatic smile. But wait, before you start drafting the obituary for American free markets, let's check the other side of the ledger. The sovereign wealth fund? Stalled? You heard the fanfare, you saw the renderings, and then nothing, like announcing a gourmet feast and serving kibble. The TikTok deal? No government stake. You had national security hawks circling, but the final structure kept the state out of the equity. And no bank was nationalized. Not one. You didn't see the Treasury walking into JPMorgan with a name tag and a keycard. So what's the fair judgment here? You've got China running its banks openly, state-owned, state-directed, no apologies. And you've got America quietly backstopping them. Emergency liquidity, implicit guarantees, strategic equity stakes. Same direction, different mechanism. One is a leash you can see, the other is an invisible fence. You get zapped either way, but only one of them leaves a mark you can photograph. And that's the irony, right? America spends decades lecturing Beijing about state capitalism, the subsidies, the industrial policy, the government's thumb on the scale, and then you look at Intel, the CFPB, the Fed pressure, the yen intervention, and you realize the thumb is on the same scale. It's just wearing a different nail polish. You don't call it state capitalism when you do it. You call it economic security or strategic resilience. But the cat doesn't care what you name the pounce. It only cares that the bird is on the ground. So no, America hasn't become China. The state isn't running the banks, the factories aren't answering to party secretaries, and you can still short a stock without a midnight knock on the door. But the drift is real. The government is a shareholder now. It fires regulators it doesn't like. It jawbones the central bank, and it intervenes in currency markets. You can call that whatever you want. Pragmatic statecraft, defensive capitalism, whatever soothes the conscience. But if you're honest, you'll admit it looks a lot like the thing you spent 40 years criticizing, just with better branding. I'll tell you what I see. You've just watched two banking systems flex, and you're probably thinking, because I was too, okay, but which one's worse? Wrong question. The right question is, which one's got your wallet in a headlock? China's banks, they're not even pretending. The state runs the show, absorbs the bad debts like a parent cleaning up after a toddler who ate crayons, and then hands you the bill through inflation and taxes. You don't see it itemized, you just notice your savings buy less noodles every year. That's the hidden part, hidden like a cat in a cardboard box, except the cat is your shrinking purchasing power. America's banks? Smoother. They whisper free market while quietly holding hands with the Treasury under the table, and when they trip, taxpayers catch them. You remember 2008? You paid for that. You're still paying for that through money printing that quietly skims value off every dollar you earn, right? So here's your reality. Both systems run on the same unspoken promise: too big to fail, too connected to jail. The state won't let them collapse, but someone's holding the bag. In China, it's you the saver, watching your deposits get nibbled by inflation like a slow-motion tax. In America, it's you the taxpayer, funding bailouts you never voted for. Two different ledgers, same bottom line: your money, their safety net. Think about it. When a bank is state-owned or systemically important, what they're really saying is, we can take risks, and you'll absorb the losses. That's not banking. That's a subscription service for other people's mistakes, and you never signed up. So next time some headline screams "world's biggest bank," don't just scroll past. Ask 3 questions. 1, is the asset real, or is it a spreadsheet pretending to be a skyscraper? 2, who's carrying the bad debt, the bank or you with a different hat on? 3, if this thing wobbles, who writes the bailout check? Spoiler: it's never the CEO's personal Venmo. You know, we love to argue about which system is more broken. Meanwhile, both systems have already agreed on one thing: you're the collateral. We're all just customers at 2 different restaurants where the house always orders dessert and puts it on our tab. 2 ledgers, 1 loser. The invoice is always addressed to you. Subscribe? I'm a cat with strong opinions about who pays, and I've got 9 lives worth of receipts.